Again, I say, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, we shall bind up the nation's wounds and cherish peace.
Abraham Lincoln, America's 16th president, was assassinated on April 15, 1865. The assassination took place in Ford's Theater. This assassination would grow to be one of the most impactful killings, with the killer being John Wilkes Booth. But most of the time, people fail to mention the other conspirators: Lewis Powell, David Harold, Michael O'Laughlin, George Atzerodt, but most notably, Mary and John Surratt. With that being said, it is debated on whether or not Mary Surratt was treated any differently in terms of her association with the conspirators. While many still believe Mary Surratt wasn't treated differently because her trial along with the other conspirators were held at a military tribunal, Mary Surratt really was treated differently. She was treated differently in terms of how her trial was held in comparison to John Surratt's, how she was treated at prison, and how she was treated at her execution. But back to the basics. Who really were John and Mary Surratt? Born in Maryland, Mary Surratt was a Catholic woman. Mary had lived in a house with her husband that they had built in 1852. The Surratt house still remains in Maryland today, which has now been converted to a museum for people to visit. Mary had grown up to have 3 children, one of which being John Surratt. John Surratt had been a Confederate spy during the Civil War. Later on, he had met John Wilkes Booth, Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, and David Harold. They had originally conspired to kidnap President Lincoln. The 5 had planned to hold him hostage in order to exchange him for Confederate prisoners of war, along with a number of other plans. Though none of these plans succeeded, of course, the meetings were still held regularly. These meetings had been held at none other than Mary Surratt's boarding house. This boarding house still remains in Washington, D.C. to this day. Within the past week before the assassination, Robert E. Lee had surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant. The federal capital had been celebrating the victory, as well as the fact the vicious war was coming to a close. With the Civil War ending, Lincoln had believed to be in less danger. On the day of the assassination, Mary Surratt herself had met with John Wilkes Booth. Booth had given her things to take to her tavern, south of Washington. Strong evidence points to that she had taken the materials and asked the man who she gave them to if the shooting irons were ready, referencing weapons. That night, Lincoln was shot and killed. A surgeon named Charles Augustus Leo had tried to revive him. Unfortunately, Leo was unable to save him. "I can't save him. His wound is mortal. It is impossible for him to recover." At 7:22 a.m., Lincoln was pronounced dead. On July 7, 1865, 4 of the co-conspirators in Lincoln's assassination were hanged for their crimes, including Mary Surratt. Mary had been the first woman to ever be executed by the U.S. government, and as such, many concerns of the public had risen. These concerns had dated back farther than just the execution, though. Due to Mary's gender, she was treated differently on many occasions, one primarily being at Carroll Prison. Carroll Prison was said to be a much more stable place for women than for the men. According to a paper published in 2013, it states, "Carroll Prison was a filthy place, but in general, women prisoners were treated better than that of the men. but women's cells were less crowded and somewhat better equipped than those for men. Mrs. Surratt's treatment contrasted with that of Arnold, Payne, Atzerott, and O'Laughlin, who were roughly handled aboard the ironclads. With this, Mary was clearly treated differently in comparison to the other male conspirators, but some still believed that Mary wasn't treated differently at all due to her trial being held in the same place with the rest of them. See, Mary's trial, along with the others, had taken place before a military tribunal instead of before a civil jury. While some debated this unjust, on a broadcast from 2009, historian Anthony Pitch had revealed,
"The main reason is that in a military trial, to convict they only had to have a simple majority to convict and a 2/3 majority to hang. In a civil trial, there had to be unanimity amongst the jurors. That would have been almost impossible to achieve in Washington in Lincoln's time, because Washington, D.C. was split between devotees of the Union and ardent supporters of the South. And if they'd drawn them from ordinary civilians, I don't think they would ever have got a jury that could agree unanimously on a verdict."
Though Mary wasn't treated differently in comparison to the other conspirators in terms of trial, she had been treated differently in her comparison to her own son, John Surratt. See, at the time of the assassination, he had fled to Rome. He had joined papal forces there, but 2 years after the assassination, he had been turned in to the American authorities. John Surratt was tried in a civil trial in comparison to Mary. This is possibly due to the timing of such events and the state of America after the death of the president, which may have played a part in Mary's treatment as well. The judge had believed that because John was once a seminarian, he couldn't be guilty. The jury was split, and as such, John Surratt was freed. Though, in a courthouse in Rockville, Maryland, he had admitted to his guilt in John Wilkes Booth's plans against Lincoln. Finally, Mary Surratt was treated differently in her execution. At the time of the execution, many people had been indecisive about Mary Surratt's sentence. Some had believed because she was a woman, she had deserved a punishment that was more lenient, rather than being hanged. A public outrage had begun to stir, especially since her amount of accomplice was still debated in general. With a divide between Americans on whether she should be executed or not, the government had compromised. In the end, the government had still declared her guilty and sentenced to death, but she was treated differently on the day of her execution. During this time, she was not shackled, handcuffed, or hooded as a way to maintain her dignity on the day of her death. Despite the debate surrounding her innocence and treatment regarding Mary Surratt, the government had shown diplomacy in handling her trial and execution. Thus, not only will Lincoln's assassination go down as one of the most impactful killings of all time, but perhaps Mary's trial will as well.